I'm going to use
that.
Yeah, they tried to give me the headset, but it wouldn't fit my head. I don't know what that says about me, but anyway, it didn't fit my head. Good to be back with you guys again. Thank you for coming to the workout early. Workout. Workshop. It was workout for me. I was working hard up here. Coming to the workshop, I mentioned in both workshops, I have loved being here. Didn't know what to expect. I've known Pastor Corey for years and just love him. And man, Mike, who's on my team, many of you met him. Mike and I have just fallen in love with Carolina Movement and what's happening here and just catching your vision for multiplication. And so, I planted in 1997. We didn't have what you guys have. We had it easier in so many ways. You could throw out some signs and flyers and a few hundred people show up. That doesn't work as easily nowadays. But in my generation, when I planted, and probably owe you guys an apology because there's something we didn't model well, and that was having a heart for multiplication. When I planted, me and guys, a lot of guys like me, we were addicted to addition. It's hard to multiply when you're addicted to addition. If you're addicted to addition, you sort of have to ask why. I'm so thankful for, I did some work with North American Mission Board, and I'm so thankful for Vance Pittman, who's come in providing leadership, because I've known Vance for years. And Vance, forgive me, I hadn't even started my talk yet. Off track already. Vance's story, I love it because he's like, he had fastest growing church in Las Vegas, and he had his admin guy run the numbers and went, if we keep growing at this rate and Vegas keeps growing at this rate, we won't put a dent in lostness in Las Vegas. And then he had his admin guy run the numbers. If we plant a church every 5 years that runs 250, that plants a church every 5 years, it actually reduced the lostness. Some of you guys aren't wired to build big mega churches. I wasn't. That's okay. I do believe you're wired to multiply. Can I be honest with you? I think it's easier to multiply. Nothing wrong with big churches. I've worked for 2 mega churches. The thing when I told Pastor Greg when I went to work at Seacoast, and I promise I'll get to my talk in a minute. 3 months into working with Seacoast, I said, man, I didn't. God grew our church to about 700, 800 when I left. And I said, I thought I was going to come here and learn a lot and discover y'all had it all together. What I've discovered is you got the same problems I had. There's just more zeros on the end. Be careful what you wish for. Some of you are dreaming of this big church with a lot of zeros on the end. With every zero, there's more headaches, more problems. But man, multiplication, it's okay to grow a big church, but don't miss the joy of multiplication. Isn't it funny in the book of Acts that God had to force them to multiply? So, we want to see a church planting movement. And I love Mike, if you're still in here, Mike Pittman. Man, thank you for driving this. Carolina Movement, thank you for driving this, that churches plant churches. Individuals don't plant churches. Churches plant churches. When we started our church plant network years ago, we were like, hey, you cannot pass the assessment unless you have a sending church, because churches plant churches. And I was the founder of Brian Bloy and I were the founders of the network. And I was like, hey, I don't want to have to pastor a bunch of orphan church planters. Their sending church should be pastoring them and fathering them. And so I just appreciate you guys, your dedication to multiplication. I got a phone call from a network years ago because of my involvement with church planting over the years, and they reached out and they said, hey, Mac, do you know anybody that wants to plant a church in San Francisco? We got money, we got funding, we want to plant a church in San Francisco. And I said, actually, no, I don't know anybody. I said, but don't you have churches in San Francisco? And they said, yeah, we do. I said, well, that's interesting. You don't have any church planters in that church, in those churches. And I hung up the phone and I thought, everybody's trying to find a church planter. There's a lot more churches that want to plant churches, but everybody's trying to find a church planter. And it hit me. We don't have a church planting problem in this nation. Mac, I don't know about that. Yeah, we do. It's hard to find church planters. No. We don't have a church planting problem. We have a discipleship problem. You see, the fruit of the problem is a lack of church planters. The root of the problem is lack of discipleship. I know you want to plant, and you're going, Mac, I want to be a church planting church. We just can't find anybody. You're looking too soon. Look for 15-year-old and up in your church. Stop looking at people for what they are and start looking at people for what they can be if you develop them over a period of time. You say, man, I want to be a church planting church. But be honest with you, Mac, if we did find one, I wouldn't know what to do with them. I want to be a church planting church, but if I do, I'm just busy trying to keep my church alive. How can I send somebody else? And guys, I'm just give you, wrap up with this one message, guys. I have one message for you. Start making disciple makers. Can I tell you, that solves so many problems. You start making disciple makers, you're going to have leaders. You start making disciple makers, you're going to see an evangelistic movement. Start making disciple makers, you got enough people that when you lead them to Christ, you got somebody who can disciple them. Start making disciple makers. Jesus said, I will build my church. Stop worrying about building his church. Jesus said, I will build my church. You go make disciples. Leave the church growth to me. Just go make disciples. I love what Dhati Lewis says. Dhati Lewis says, disciple making isn't a program of the church. It is the program of the church. It is the program of the church. And yet what we do, we put all these additional programs in the church that have nothing to do with discipleship and are not helping people take the next step to move and begin to live like Jesus and lead like Jesus. And then we wonder, how come I can't find any church planters? How come the seminaries are drying up? How come certain denominations that I get phone calls from, they can't find pastors to fill the pulpits of those that are retiring? It's a discipleship problem. And so, you were in a breakout. I don't have time to go into my story about when I dove in and began to study, how did Jesus do it? How did he get a movement going? Let's see if this works from up here. It's not going to work from up here. So, guys, can you just advance it to the chart? That's all I need. Just give me the chart. All right. So, I started studying through the life of Christ and say, how did Jesus get a movement going? And as I looked at the life of Christ and laid it out in chronological order, things just started jumping off the page about how Jesus got a movement going. Corey, I have no idea what time I started, and I can't see what time it is. Thank you. Is that how much time I have left? Okay, thank you. All right, so started studying through the life of Christ and said, okay, how did Jesus get a movement going? There's so much I want to show you on this, but Jesus started his public ministry with his baptism in 26 A.D. One of the points I want to emphasize here is I want you to see how strategic Jesus is. Prayerfully strategic, and his strategy didn't always make sense. He received it from God, led by the Spirit. So, baptized, what happened? Led by the Spirit. Matthew chapter 4, I believe it's verse 1. Led by the Spirit, Jesus went into the wilderness to be tempted. That doesn't make sense. He was just baptized. God announces, this is my son whom I'm well pleased. Okay, now, You just announced your public ministry. What do? You disappear for 40 days. That doesn't make any sense. But it does from God's perspective because, hey, go get the spiritual fortitude, get a victory over Satan, build the spiritual fortitude because you are getting ready to do 3 years of stinking ministry that's going to blow the world away. I need you to win some strong battles against Satan, one-on-one, nose to nose, eyeball, eyeball. You're going to defeat him right there, and you're going to leave that place with spiritual fortitude after 40 days of fasting. That was a strategic move. The next Gosh, watch this, guys. The next 7-8 months aren't recorded except by John. It's his early Judean ministry. In his early Judean ministry, there in John chapter 4, I believe it's verse 1, where it says Jesus has been in Judea. He's baptizing more people than John the Baptist. And then it says in John 4:1, Jesus had to go through Samaria. Why did he have to go through Samaria? That word had to means compelled. He was compelled to go through Samaria. I got to go through Samaria. Why? Did God download on him? Yes, strategically. Got to go through Samaria. He goes to Samaria for one lady, leads that one lady to Christ. Boom. All of a sudden, an evangelistic outbreak happens throughout Samaria. And then where does he go? Spends a few days there, goes to Galilee. Do you see what's happening here? Jesus is modeling Acts 1:8 before he ever told everybody to go do Acts 1:8. What I want you to see is, yes, we need to evangelize. Yes, we need to disciple. I want you to see how they come together. Jesus is evangelizing. Then he goes 1 year later, and Mike, if you're back there, you can go to the come and see, or we already did come and see. I'm going to show you these 5 strategic movements. Jesus meets 5 of what would be his apostles right here in the fall of 26 AD. Then we go a year later, 1 year later, all of a sudden, he gets Peter, James, Andrew, and John, says, follow me, I will make you fishers of men. He calls them into followership, calls them into discipleship full time. Very strategic move here is what he's doing. All right? He disciples them for several months, and then Luke 6, another strategic move. He goes up on a mountain. He prays all night. The only place that Greek word is used is where he prayed without ceasing throughout the entire night. Why? Because it's at this point, 21 months into his public ministry, he goes up on a mountain and he prays like, okay, God, who do you want me to choose as the key leaders of this movement? I want to see a movement that will explode across the world, but I have to choose the right people, and I cannot do it apart from prayer. So he prays the entire night, agonizing over, God, who do you want me to choose? He comes down from the mountain the next morning. He calls his disciples to himself, says Luke. How many? We don't know. But he calls his disciples to himself. He goes down from the mountain, and he says, you follow me, and you follow me, and you follow me. 11, 12, you follow me. Everybody else, you go home. You 12, come over here. You made the basketball team. Come over here with me. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. The rest of the 24 months that I have left on this earth, I'm investing in you 12. You are my priority. I'm no longer doing basic disciple with you. I'm discipling you as leaders. I'm discipling you as planters. I'm discipling you as movement makers. And so he calls those disciples. He handpicks them. And then after he does 6 months of training with them, Mike, go to that next slide. He does 6 months of training with them. Oh, we got to go into that during the workshop. That was fun. And then after appointing them in Luke 6, in the summer of 28, in the winter of 29, he sends them. And there were 6 months before he gave them authority and power. When he selected them in Luke 6, in the summer of 28, he did not give them authority and power until he trained them. He trained them, then he gave them authority and power, and then he sends them out 2 by 2 into the 240 villages of Galilee. By the way, let's talk about prayerfully strategic again. Jesus has already done 3 tours through the villages of Galilee, spreading the seeds of the gospel. 240 villages of Galilee. When he would go do that, it was just him trying to reach these 240 villages, but now that he's done it and then he models it for them, now he sends them out to do it. That's a 1 to 40 ratio. 1 strike team for, I wasn't planning on talking about this. I wish I would have brought the map. All of a sudden, boom, you break up the 240 villages in 6 segments. Now you see Jesus saturating that region of Galilee with the gospel. Why didn't he start in Judea? Why didn't he just concentrate? He didn't. Strategically, he needed to base his ministry in Capernaum, prayerfully strategic. And then he tells those guys, when he sends them out to preach the gospel in the village of Galilee, I want you to identify the next leaders, teaching them to reproduce themselves. A year later, what happens? He sends out the 72 in 30 AD. He sends out the 72 to saturate Galilee and the rest of the nation. And then, Mike, go ahead. And then after his resurrection, he says, go be movement makers. Go make disciples of all nations. Didn't say go build my church. He said, go make disciples. I taught this one day, and somebody said, there's no evidence the disciples ever reproduced. Look at this next slide. Yes, there is. Church history. Look. Church planting movement started because Jesus made disciple makers. Yes, there are people in your church. You want them to make disciples, but concentrate your time on making disciple makers. And besides, listen to this. Listen. You've not made a disciple until your disciples made a disciple. And unfortunately, in our country, there's a bunch of half-baked disciples running around because we've not made disciples that know how to make disciples. Because you know what they think discipleship is? They're looking at us as the model. So what is discipleship? Discipleship's holding a microphone in your hand and teaching people theology, the Bible, and spiritual disciplines. I'm telling you guys, I'm working with churches every week on this stuff. There is such a paradigm shift that has to happen in our minds, in our souls, in our hearts. We've got to learn to make disciple makers. I tell church planners all the time, stop counting attendance and just count your disciple makers. You don't have to stop counting attendance. That's important. But start counting your disciple makers. If I was a church planter today, you know what? I would invest a disproportionate amount of time to the point people would complain about me and leave our church because I'm going to spend a disproportionate amount of time with my disciple makers. Because it starts with me. Pastor, you're the lead disciple maker in your church. You want to see evangelistic movement? You want to see a discipleship movement? Just start discipling people. Just start disciple makers. And let God grow the church. You disciple makers. It lights their heart on fire. Man. Sorry, I'm not doing my talk. There's an issue. Another issue at the heart when we make disciples. Last year, I was studying through the Gospels again. And I was intrigued that the disciples aren't getting it. How many times did Jesus look at them and say, how come you can't get this? Forgive me, I don't have the chart. Mike, go back to that chart. I don't have this one, but go back to the Jesus chart. We know that the disciples were like arguing about who's going to be the greatest. We know that they did that. They did it 3 times. You ever think about when they did it? They did it in the fall of 29 after Jesus predicted his death the first time. They did it after Jesus predicted his death in the fall of 29 a second time. And they were arguing who was going to be the greatest at the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper. They weren't getting it. They misunderstood what leadership was. And Jesus had been teaching them, please understand this. It takes a while for people to learn leadership. It takes a season for somebody to season. You can't train a leader in 5 weeks. I'm sorry. You can't develop a leader in a 2-hour workshop. You just can't do it. You might feel good because you dispensed the information, but I promise it didn't produce transformation. I love this. I love you. This is a lot of fun. But I would much rather to sit here with these two guys and spend an hour talking about some leadership competency, because I'm going to understand. I will see exactly if you're comprehending what I'm talking about. I can assess, we can assess your competency level, and I can know exactly what your next steps are. I don't have a clue about that right now for you guys. Some of you are thinking about going home right now, or thinking about the grocery store, or thinking about the ball game, whatever. I don't know. I'm not saying this isn't valuable, but I'm just telling you, I can't measure your comprehension or your competency development in this environment, but I can in this environment. That's why we need more of this. Keep doing that, but we got to have more of this. Listen, if every person, there's 100 people in this room, say, if every person in this room just left and said, hey, Mac, I'm going to start discipling 2 people as leaders, this room would produce 200 new leaders in the next 3 to 6 months. It's just, and that multiplication effect just explodes. Anyway, let me get back to this real quick. So they're misdefining leadership. And so if you look at what Jesus was doing, he had already defined leadership for them. He had told him, a leader is a disciple. What's a disciple? It's a learner. A leader is a servant that puts others' interest above others. And a leader is an apostle. Whoa. Which was a Greek word that 400 years before the life of Christ was used to speak of an admiral of a ship that was sent out by a king to go explore unconquered territories and find a territory, unload the ship, and build a colony that's representative of the culture of the king. That's what leaders do. Leaders, they never stop learning. Our people aren't interested in leadership development. Then they're not a disciple. And it's my job to create the hunger anyway. I want to provide leadership development so good that they're beating down the doors to be a part of it, because they're so hungry for good stuff. A leader is a servant. A leader is a learner. But a leader is one who shapes culture. And you guys, this is why we've got to stop this leadership development stuff that simply says, oh, you want to serve in our children's ministry? Great, we'll develop you as a leader. And we teach them the policies and procedures and how to handle things, bathroom, that's important. All that stuff's important, but that's not leadership development. We're simply teaching them to turn a ministry widget rather than to live a biblical lifestyle of leadership. You guys, what could happen in your church if you begin to teach people to lead like Jesus? To disciple them to lead like Jesus, to live a biblical lifestyle of leadership that steps into their work environment as a servant, as a learner, and as a culture shaper. People are, it's going to blow their minds, and people are going to look at them and go, where did you learn to lead like this? My church. I'm just doing what Jesus did. If we want to reach the lost, let's raise up leaders who influence their culture, and they live so radically different that it gets people's attention. But that's never going to happen if we just teach people to turn our ministry widget, because we're not squeezing out of this what could happen. You guys, the local church should be the greatest leadership development organization on the planet. There's no reason you can't. Because you see, we've got the best book ever written that has promised that the word will not return void. We've got the best model that has ever walked the planet. And we've got the Holy Spirit that resides within us. Why is the church not raising up the best leaders on the planet? Where's our priority? Where's our focus? What do we... Why are we missing this? Why is it, those of you who came to the workshop, that in 2008, the church's biggest struggle was leadership development. 2018, the church, according to the surveys, leadership development is the #1 issue. Why is this not changing? I'm going to tell you why it's not changing. Because nobody's teaching us to make disciple makers. And we've just reverted just to dispensing information rather than producing transformation. We got to go back and we got to raise up disciple makers, and then tell those disciple makers after you raise them up to make disciple makers. Sean, I didn't even get to talk to y'all about Leadership Pipeline, but how many were in the workshop? Okay, most good. So you know the pipeline. I taught it. First church I ever taught it to was Grace Church in Boston, Sean Sears. Sean's church was running 100 people. He came to this workshop that I did. I taught Leadership Pipeline first time. I didn't know if it would work. I taught him the whole framework. Sean starts FaceTiming me once a week or once a month, just irritating the fire out of me. I'm just teasing. But just chasing me. Hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? He built the Leadership Pipeline. His church run 100 people. He wanted to be church planting church. Fast forward 10 years. Grace Church has planted 10 churches around Boston out of their church. They've planted more churches than that, but 10 out of their church in Boston in 10 years. Because they took the pipeline and they began to work it. They became disciplined with it. I ran into Sean at Exponential. And we're standing there, we're talking, and there was a crowd of young men over here. I didn't really notice. And then somebody hollered at Sean and said, Sean, you got to go. And I said, what are you doing? What's this? He said, that's 18 young men from my church who are either leader, coach, or director level that we believe might have a call in their life for church planting. So every year at Exponential, we bring anybody at any level of our pipeline that we feel like might have a call to church planting, and we expose them to this week of a church planting conference. And at the end of the week, we sit down with them and say, did God move on any of your hearts? He's got a full pipeline. You guys, you want to get a movement going. Put that pathway that I shared with you earlier. Just put a leadership pathway together. Team member, leader, coach, director, senior leader. Pray the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth workers. Just like Jesus did. He prayed in Luke 6 before he chose his 12. He told the 12 to pray about who they would select. He told the 72 to pray about who they would select. Saturate your selection process with prayer. And then you just identify 2 to 3 people that you're going to start discipling in leadership. Now, Jesus did this as he saturated Galilee with the gospel. So he was going and evangelizing, but in doing so, he was discipling men who would go do the same. It's fit together. And so, what if? What if? I dare you. Take the risk. Choose 2 to 3 people. And over the next 6 months, start meeting with them every other week and just start discipling them in leadership. Ralph Moore, I was sitting in a room, 30 seconds. Ralph Moore, I was sitting in a room with him. If you don't know who he is, he planted Hope Chapel in 1970. Sitting in a room with him, and Todd Wilson introduced him, and there's a few of us in there, and he said, Todd said, Ralph planted Hope Church, and out of Hope Church, they planted, I forgot the number, but it's over 1,000, but it's like, planted, 1,261 churches. Ralph is 70-something years old, very humble, and he went, 12,172. And I called Ralph one day, and I said, Ralph, how'd you do it? How'd you do that? See, his church planted 30 churches. He said, what I did is I disciple makers who will be church planting churches. And out of those 30 that Hope planted in all his years there, they can attribute to over 1,000, 1,500 churches that have planted out of Hope Church. I said, Ralph, how'd you do it? He said, well, it's easy. I'd find 2 or 3 guys, and whether I took them through the book of Ephesians or whether I took them through Jim Collins' Good to Great, we would meet every other week or every week, and I would ask them, what did God say to you through that chapter? What are you going to do about it? How can I help you? That's how Ralph Moore's church planted 30 churches that end up planting over 1,000 more churches. Don't overcomplicate it. Jesus said, go make disciples. Don't forget who he said that to. The most uneducated fisherman. So it can't be that hard. I don't know what's next. I didn't pay attention. Oh, thank you. God, thank you for this time together. Thank you for Carolina Movement. Thank you, God. I don't know what it is. I told Mike, I told my team this morning, there is a special spirit in this room on these people. There is a what I'm really sensing and believing, and what I told my team today, there is a multiplication grace that's being poured out on this movement. Thank you that it's called Carolina Movement, not Carolina Edition. And so, Father, I pray that your Spirit would take all that these guys and ladies have heard over the past 48 hours, sift it out so that each one can understand what steps you want them to take. And then, God, would you do exceedingly abundantly more than they could ask or imagine? Because, God, we don't want to go do something in our own power. We want to do it in your power. So go do beyond what they could imagine. Use this group, God, to expand the gospel across North Carolina. In Jesus' name, amen.